is it inevitable that at some point, later on in the 20th century, they're going to have to lock horns again?
So nothing is inevitable, James. That's important.
I can't stress enough this idea that there's this perception, and well, not just a perception, Germany's saying it, we will put raiding groups out into the world and we will disrupt trade. Well, there's only one trade that's going to be disrupted, and that's British trade.
Was Britain right to enter the First World War in August 1914?
You see, it's a tricky one.
It's deterministic, isn't it?
Well, so the way I see it is that knowing what we know now, quite possibly not.
Look at what we did during the Franco-Prussian War. We weren't worried then. And yet, having said that, everybody expected France to defeat Prussia quite heavily, and it didn't happen.
When I look at it, I'm a bit like, oh, as a historian.
Look at the way the Hague's reputation changed. I mean, at the end of the First World War, he was a national hero. Now it's far more nuanced.
Nuanced, I think, is a kind word.
It's the 4th of August 1914, and the British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, has just made a decision which will change history forever. Only 7 days earlier, Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia, marking the start of the First World War. And now it was time for Britain to do the same to Germany. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been met with a somewhat muted reaction in Britain, and involvement in a European war was far from certain. Yet, British foreign policy was about maintaining a power balance on the continent, and Germany was rapidly becoming a dominant and antagonistic force. So, perhaps reluctantly, Britain was now at war. But was this a choice that had to be made? Or was it a huge error that could have been avoided? James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's Britain's decision to enter into the First World War. In modern times it's become a point of debate on whether this was an inevitable necessity or a strategic mistake. We're here to ask what the world might have looked like if that call had never been made. That's a question for our experts, and joining me, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning once again to the channel is Professor Alexander Watson from Goldsmiths University. Welcome to you both. Now, before we get into the beginning of the First World War and why Britain did engage, we've got a map in front of us now showing the British Empire as it would have been at the start of the First World War in 1914. Alex, welcome back to History Undone.
Thank you.
I wonder, first of all, if you can explain what Britain is in control of at this point and why it would have the empire at the centre of its thinking at this stage.
So in 1914, we're obviously looking at a very, very different world from today. And the one superpower across the globe is Britain. It's the one world power. America is largely isolated. The United States of America is largely isolationist. France, major competitor, of course, to Britain, but by 1914 also an ally. Russia as well, an ally. And then in the middle of Europe, we have Germany, the rising power. Germany and I guess the US as well are potential competitors. But Britain at this time controls the seas. It enforces a doctrine of free trade. And what we're seeing in 1914 is a really globalized world in which Britain controls the sea routes, large parts of North America, Africa, Australasia, and of course at the centre of the empire, India.
Chris Parry, always a pleasure to have you by my side for History Undone. Talk to us about the power balance of the world at this point, because Britain's worried in part about preserving its empire, understandably, but you've also got this complex network of alliances going on in Europe and across the world. So what is the state of play?
So, as we've already mentioned, the policy throughout the 19th century for Britain was to maintain its empire, but also this balance of power within Europe where you've got no overriding, dominating country. That's now been challenged by the rise of Germany, which, of course, after its war with France in 1870-71, has become the German Empire. And economically, geopolitically and militarily, it has grown out of all proportion to what it was. It's still an empire. They're all separate kingdoms within it, but it's headed by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, Germany is allied very much with Austro-Hungary, which obviously has connections historically. That's another empire, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the heir of the Habsburgs of the 16th century. And they are dominating the whole of Central Europe. But there are residual problems in the Balkan states, and you've got a decaying Turkish empire as well that is involved in that. Now, Britain towards the end of the 19th century starts to feel a bit vulnerable with this balance of power. And so they start initially by having a treaty with Japan. And that helps safeguard the empire in the east so they can concentrate on what's going on in Europe. King Edward VII, he's very Francophile, he likes the French, and from 1903 onwards, we start actually cooperating with the French, and that becomes a formal alliance. And there's a series of crises, mainly in Morocco, here, and a place called Agadir, which actually reinforces our alliance with the French. Now, in 1907, British government says, look, you know, we don't want to be tied too much to the continent of Europe. And the Russians say, look, we'd like to come in on this alliance with you as well. Now, of course, that looks great because what it does is completely surround this central bloc of Austro-Hungary and Germany. And in 1911, at a thing called the Agadir crisis, the Franco-British axis is reinforced by the fact that the French agree to take on naval security in the Mediterranean. The British, the North Atlantic and the North Sea against Germany and Austro-Hungary. And they also say, if it comes to war with Germany, we'll put an army of 100,000 into the continent as well. So this is building up into an armed alliance, and that's the state of play. I think the thing we should notice here is there is a progressive alignment and support for France throughout this. Various crises, as I said, the Morocco crisis, Agadir crisis, this commitment to actually cooperate is building up. So,
but based on the Entente Cordiale of 1904?
Yes, indeed. But of course, it's reinforced, as I said, by this understanding, which, and I'd say the axis is closer between France and Russia than it is perhaps with Britain. But of course, it's a great asset to have to put pressure on the Central Powers from the east.
Alex, were Britain right to be as worried as they were about the threat of German expansionism? I mean, look at the map. Look how much territory the British possess. You know, we're the top naval power at the time. Were we overly worried?
Well, so there's two threats from Germany. One is, as you say, the expansionism itself, the idea. In 1897, there's a speech by the German Chancellor calling for a place in the sun. Actually, the British aren't that worried by that. Everybody, every major power in Europe has empires. This is an imperial continent. It's an imperial world. And the Germans are getting more powerful economically. And there's some understanding in Britain that an economically powerful country also needs to be more represented politically on the world stage. The bigger worry for the British is when the Germans start building up their fleet. And that's seen as a major challenge to the control of British sea lines, British connections, maritime connections, especially with India, but right across the world. Although we've marked the areas that Britain controls directly, Britain has fingers in lots of pies right across the world, so-called informal empire. Britain dominates South America, for example, and South American trade, and it relies on those trade routes, as it has done historically. So Germany's naval build-up, especially from 1905 onwards, when there's a big battleship, big struggle to who can build the biggest type of new technologically advanced battleship, the Dreadnought, that does worry the British.
I mean, the key point on this is that if you have this new ship, Dreadnought, which revolutionises naval warfare, it's fast, it's powerful, it puts you back to zero both. So you actually have to outbuild from that point. It doesn't matter how big your navy is, if these Dreadnoughts can take out all the other types of
the naval
ship,
arms race begins again.
It starts again. And that's what intensifies this issue before the First World War, is that you have to outbuild a country that is actually beating you at the moment industrially and economically.
And just to give a sense, when Dreadnought comes out, this revolutionary battleship, the Germans start referring to all other battleships as 5-Minuten-Schiffe, 5-minute ships, because that's the estimated time of survival that they have against the guns of the Dreadnought. That's the step change in technology that this ship introduces. But of course, the Germans have their own problems because they've also got land competitors. So whereas the British can focus on their navy, the Germans also feel the need to maintain a big army. And that is also very expensive.
And if you read the German doctrine at this time, there's this tremendous desire for coal and steel. And that's what is behind this. They have to service, as Alex says, this huge army that they've built, but also a navy that needs gun turrets, it needs barrels, and obviously armour.
There is another interpretation, though, to these alliances in 1904 with France and 1907 with Russia. The Franco-Russian alliance is a military alliance. There is an obligation to support each other if they're attacked militarily. The so-called ententes, the deals that Britain has with France and Russia, they're friendly, but there isn't any contractual obligation to defend either of these countries. And there is an argument that actually Britain agreed to these friendly contracts, if you like, not because British statesmen worried about Germany, but because France was a major competitor in Africa, Russia was a major competitor in Persia along the Great Game with India. And so actually this was Britain not worrying about the continent, but thinking globally. And actually this is a way of getting rid of our big competitors, France and Russia. We make them friends. It's not about fear of Germany necessarily.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, Chris, how anxious are the British at this point about maintaining their empire? Is there this sense, of course, after the First World War, in reality, we start to see the gradual decline of the British Empire, which, of course, accelerated at the end of the Second World War. Is there that concern in Britain in 1914? Are they worried that the kind of British domination of the previous century is beginning to come to an end?
Obviously, when you have a global empire, you've got to be in a lot of places at once. And Alex is right. If you can actually square off potential competitors. I mean, as recently as 1898, the French and the British are basically competing here in East Africa. The Russians are constantly pressuring this area around here, particularly Iran, of course, where you get fuel from. So they are worried about that. There's no question. However, we're at the apogee of empire here. Nobody before the First World War is thinking the empire's going to go anywhere in the near future. The Americans aren't making noises about the Wilson plan or anything like that, because he's not around in the political space. And so they're feeling quite happy. They know they dominate the sea. That's the critical thing. And this is where Germany is a particular threat. And if you look at what Germany is building, they are basically there to interrupt trade.
Well,
that's the key point.
Hold that thought, because on the topic of British fears about potential German expansion, we can have a look now at another map, and I should stress this is a British propaganda map of the time, showing what some in Britain feared could happen if Germany expanded. OK, we have a new map in front of us now. This is that British propaganda map of the time, showing what some people feared could happen if the Germans expanded, disrupted the British Empire. And you can see the red on the map represents where the Germans may have ended up in control of. Alex, I'll start with you on this one. I mean, I think it's fair to say you're sceptical about this map, but clearly this was a fear that some people in Britain had.
It was a fear some people had. When I look at it, I'm a bit like, oh, as a historian. As a piece of British propaganda, it's a great example of how the British mobilised their population against the Germans in the First World War, and also about British anxieties about losing control of the world. Bear in mind, of course, that a lot of these possessions are British, and Britain was the dominant world power. And Germany wanted to change that. There's no doubt about that. Whether it actually reflects German official war aims, which shifted and changed during the war, I'm very, very doubtful. I don't think it does. But there's no doubt that, especially at the start of the war, and especially at the end of the war, when things seemed to be going very well at first, and then when there'd been all this effort and resources poured into the war, Germany was prepared to get as much as it possibly could and make the most of any victory it was able to.
And Chris, the anxiety that some in Britain have is not just about the territory, it's about naval domination.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the sea, as I do, as the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web before the digital age, if you can control the links between commodities, manufacturers and markets, you're controlling the world. It's as simple as that. What is also quite alarming to the average Brit about this is the choke points of the world. Okay, so around the bottom here of South America, South Africa, through the Middle East, Straits of Malacca, are really vulnerable under this sort of ambition. But the thing I'd like to point out on this map, though, is number 4. Look how number 4 dominates the whole of the Indian Ocean and has a real strategic leverage. And of course, that's the Chagos Islands, which people will be familiar with. And this map, more than anything, explains why no country in its right mind should be giving up the Chagos Islands.
And of course, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire at this point is India.
India.
Yeah.
There's maybe one other thing as well we should point out, which is that when we think about military history or wars in general, we think a lot about land, and maps are great in that you can colour the land in to show who owns what. But actually, naval connections, these sea links, are critically important. It's no coincidence that in 1918, when the armistice is signed, the major British demand is not for any German territory or any overseas territory, it's to get the German fleet, to confiscate it and to bring it to Scapa Flow, the main British port. That's the major war aim of this conflict, the 1418 conflict for Britain. It's not any land grabs, any territory. It's above all, actually, eliminating the German fleet.
And on that, Alex, every single German politician and military officer, apart from Hindenburg, says it was the British Navy that did for us, because they had the close and the distant blockade, and we just could not sustain the war effort. So one could say that the army fixed the German army while the Navy actually won the war.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, Alex, is, of course, officially, the main justification for Britain entering the First World War was when Germany invaded Belgium and basically threatened Belgian neutrality, and therefore the British went in. Is that a bit of a cover? I mean, was that really the pretense that the British government used because they had other reasons to take the fight to Germany?
I would say yes. I mean, there was some legal basis for Britain to go into this war. There was a treaty signed in 1839 by the powers which supported the setting up of Belgium, guaranteeing Belgium. And Britain was one of those signatories. So there was a case to be made that Britain should defend Belgium. Of course, there was a similar treaty when Ukraine became an independent state in 1991, the Budapest Memorandum, in which Britain and the US also agreed to support those territories.
And Russia.
And above all, Russia, yeah, exactly. And sometimes these things don't necessarily do what they're meant to do on the paper. But as the war broke out, as the war was about to break out at the end of July, the British cabinet was of the majority view that actually the 1839 treaty didn't oblige Britain to go to war in defence of Belgium. That only shifted when it dawned on the British cabinet just how bad German control of the North European coast would be for British strategic interests. And at that point, suddenly, these legal obligations seem to be much, much more important.
Do you agree with that, Chris?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the way the cabinet discussions went at the time, there's a lot more going on than this scrap of paper, as Bethmann Hollweg called it in the negotiations on the 29th, 30th of July. I mean, the key stimulus, essentially, is the 1st of August when the French mobilise. And then, of course, the Germans attack on the 4th of August. And it involves Belgium and France. But what I think we need to bear in mind is the consistent support for defending France that has been going on for the best part of a decade. Our interests have been very closely aligned. And as I said, we were committed to putting 100,000 troops onto the ground from 1911 onwards. And the army has been structured for that reason. But there are other things going on at the same time. The Britons are very wary. They've just staved off a civil war in Ireland. Because of the Home Rule Act and this, that and the other. And they very quickly, at the start of the war, bring in a Government of Ireland Act that says, look, this is what we're going to do in future, but we're suspending it for the duration of the war. So they try and park the Irish problem. The other issue is that the Liberal Party doesn't want to go to war. This is the governing party under Asquith. What they're saying is we do have to defend France, though. And the two leading proponents of that, the only proponents in the cabinet, are the Prime Minister Asquith and one Winston Churchill. And he's First Lord of the Admiralty. And Lloyd George says, a week ago, none of us, except for those two, wanted to go to war. Now, what they're worried about is they have a split within the governing party, and the Conservatives then take power, because the Conservatives are absolutely gunning for this and saying, look, we've always promised to defend France. If we don't deal with Germany now, we'll never get the chance to do it. And this offers us an opportunity because Russia's engaged and so is France. So you can see that party politics play a role here. And there's also a suspicion that actually we need to deal with Germany. There are these upstarts who are trying to take over from us. They want these imperial possessions. They want to challenge us at sea. And the Kaiser, is a bit of a figure of both fun and hate at this time.
He's a bogeyman.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. And he's pushy and he's upset, the royal family and all that sort of thing. What's really interesting is the press, by and large, are saying we don't need a war. If you look at the Manchester Guardian, which is not the Guardian of today, Manchester Guardian and people like C.P. Snow were saying, why are we going to give up 50 years of accumulated progress for this?
But Alex, public opinion, was it not relatively pro-war at the time?
No, not really, not at all. In fact, not until the war actually breaks out.
Okay, yeah.
But I think that also, we need to think a bit about British government leadership on this, because there's not much sense of strategy at the end of July and a lot of confusion. And that's in part because a lot of personal undertakings have been made by the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, or the Prime Minister Asquith to France. There have been these deals done, for example, as Chris has talked about, telling the army to potentially prepare to support France. But the cabinet hasn't been on board by this. And German statesmen argue that, well, Britain's stance isn't clear on this. And there is a case to be said that if Britain had been able to make a clear commitment to Germany at the end of July, a public one, we will go to war in support of France, that would have made it more likely that Germany and Austria-Hungary would have backed down and made it more likely that the war wouldn't have happened. But because the cabinet was divided, because British policy was ambiguous, that public commitment couldn't be made, and it wasn't made. And the Germans, right up until the end of July, were assuming that Britain probably wouldn't enter.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that actually there's some inter-service politics going on here. The army is trying to transform itself after the Boer War from an expeditionary army into this one that can go to the continent. And I'm afraid to say the politics amongst the senior officers is pretty interesting at this time, and it's not in accordance with the way the politicians have set it out. And so if you look at what's going on, the army is desperately trying to become a much bigger player in relation to the Navy at this time. I mean, some of it is quite traitorous, actually, to actually get the army in a place where it can actually deliver the 100,000 men, but at the same time push itself into the political space much more energetically.
Well, I'll tell you what, given we're now discussing the real history behind Britain's entry into the First World War, let's zoom in now and let's focus on Europe itself. OK, so we're going to run through the state of play in Europe at the outbreak of the war. But before we do that, let's just run through some of the key statistics of what this cost Britain. The war effort was enormous. Around 8.7 million troops served for Britain, including from its empire during the course of the war. The majority of these, around 5.4 million, served in France and Flanders. Around 886,000 military personnel lost their lives, which was around 6% of the adult male population at the time. Over 2 million further soldiers were wounded. Let's come on to this new map we've got in front of us now. And we should say this is quite a clever map in a way, because the eagle-eyed among you will notice there are two different sets of borders here. So the big colour blocks show the borders of Europe before the First World War, really around 1912. But if you note, there are some red lines on the map. These denote the borders at the end of the First World War, in reality, from 1918 onwards. Dr. Chris Parry, one thing we should mention, we touched on Winston Churchill a moment ago. There's a great anecdote about him. So
Winston Churchill is quite keen to go to war. He wants to use this navy, and he sees the political cards starting to fall. Now, just before the war, in this sort of phony war situation, you've got two German ships here, the Goeben and the Breslau. So you've got a battle cruiser and a cruiser. And they're tooling around here in the Mediterranean. And they think, OK, we need to mark those, because in the event of war, the French are going to want to get troops from North Africa across into France. And so what Churchill does is put two battle cruisers into the Mediterranean to mark them. And they spend their time looking at each other, wondering if they're going to go to war at some stage. And the British think, OK, we've got this covered. As long as we can block the Straits of Gibraltar, they can't get out. And one of the things I've always learned in military strategy is if it's not impossible, it's possible. And what happens is, on the outbreak of war, and let me tell you on the way that Winston Churchill is anticipating going to war, so he actually leaves a telegram on his desk, which actually mobilises the fleet and says, commence hostilities. Now, he just wants that in case he has to send it. But overnight, a civil servant picks it up and says, oh, he obviously wants us to go to war, and actually sends it out and pre-mobilises the fleet. And they have to actually draw back and say, no, we're not at war yet. So a real interesting situation there. But what happens with the Goeben and the Breslau, just as war is declared, the two Invincible-class battle cruisers are holding to the west. But in fact, what the Goeben and the Breslau do is they head this way. And just here, they're encountered by a British force of armoured cruisers who decide not to engage. Because, as we said, they're 5-minuters, and the Admiral in command, who gets pretty censored for it, as you can imagine, being British at the height of its power, lets them go by without engaging. And in fact, it's used as an example in the Second World War as to why the Battle of the River Plate happened. And of course, a massive sort of German ship, the Graf Spee, is taken on by 3 British cruisers. But they slip past, and the British are thinking, well, we've still got them bottled up in the Mediterranean. And at this point, the Goeben and the Breslau go to Constantinople, and the Germans give them to the Turks. Now, they remain crewed by the Germans, and the Germans actually make a great show of wearing fezzes. And for the rest of the war, they actually operate in the Black Sea against the Russians. And the gift of those 2 ships to Turkey actually brings Turkey in on the German and the Austro-Hungarian side. And the excuse they have is that 2 battleships being built in Britain for the Turkish Navy at the start of the war are promptly impounded and renamed the Agincourt, familiar name recently, and the Erin, and they actually form part of the Grand Fleet instead of going to Turkey.
That is a fascinating story. I had no idea about that. Alex, so let's zoom out a bit here. Let's talk about the real reasons that Britain decided, you know what, we have to enter the First World War. Imagine I'm Herbert Asquith in 1914 and you're advising me, and I come to you and I go, OK, what would be the reasons? Give me the case for why Britain should enter the First World War in 1914.
OK, number 1, Asquith feels a moral obligation to France. And more than that, there have been all these promises or semi-promises made to France. And if Britain doesn't live up to them, if it doesn't supply its 100,000 troops, if it doesn't keep its part of protecting the North Sea while France covers the Mediterranean, then who's going to trust it in alliance politics afterwards? So that's the first thing, Britain's reputation and honour, which we don't talk about that much in this day and age, but in 1914 is really important. Britain's honour is at stake. That's number 1. Number 2, what if Germany wins? Well, it's 2 problems with Germany winning. First problem is that Germany is going through Belgium, or is likely to go through Belgium, indeed does go through Belgium. And if Germany keeps Belgium's ports, and indeed, as the Germans plan in September 1914, if they also keep French northern ports, then Britain is looking at a navy a potentially hostile navy right across on the other side of the English Channel.
Particularly the submarines. That's the key point.
But also both the battle cruisers and the submarines, both the battleships and the submarines. So that's the second fear. And the third fear is that by 1905 to 1912, there's this big naval arms race between Britain and Germany for battleships. And Britain wins that, it's able to outbuild the Germans, but it's only able to do that because a land arms race between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side and France and Russia on the other erupts from 1911. And Germany has to divert financial resources away from building more battleships, away from this naval competition with Britain, toward the arms competition, the land arms competition with Russia and with France. Now, if Germany manages to beat Russia and France, then that knocks out these two continental powers, and that would free Germany, potentially, to build an even larger fleet than Britain. Chris has already talked about Germany's greater industrial resources. And so for those reasons, honour, command of the coast of the English Channel, and fleet size, these are the reasons why the British government, Asquith, Grey, feel they have to intervene in August 1914.
So that's the argument in favour. Just go with me, Chris. If I said to you, if I'm Herbert Asquith, 1914, and you're one of my top advisors, OK, what's the counter-argument? Why shouldn't we enter the First World War? What would you say?
Well, I'd say we're doing all right. We're an island nation. The Germans have consolidated their empire. They've created a customs union that is now nationalised. They probably won't invade the whole of France. They'll do what they did in 1870, 71. We can deal with this here. We can blockade them in if we have to. We can mine them in and do all sorts of things like that. And at the end of the day, if Germany and France are knocking 10 bells out of each other, we can stand aside from that. We've got an empire. The key issue, though, is the sea. If we can maintain our dominance of the seas, that's fine. This goes away. And we honestly can't really see Germany being able to absorb France. France is always going to survive at this stage. This is not the German army of World War II. We have to remember that. It is not mechanised. It doesn't have armour. And so it's a totally different beast. So I would say stay out. And by the way, we can come in at some stage in the future.
Well, this is a key point. I mean, was this not an active argument at the time, Alex, that people were saying, look, we're not saying we never get involved in this conflict, but let's just hold our horses a minute. Let's see what the Germans do. Let's see, do they conquer Belgium? Do they move on France? And if we need to down the line, we can enter the war then.
So I think the explanation for that is we've got to move away from what we know happened and the images that we have of the trench warfare and the Battle of the Somme and this gruelling artillery-dominated bloodshed which covered Flanders and France for much of the 4 years. We need to think about what actually the British expected of this war and how they expected to fight it. And in 1914, many of the politicians saw Britain's major contribution as being maritime and financial, which are the two big British strengths. Of course, Kitchener says, no, we are going to have to supply a major land army to this. And he starts building the so-called new armies. There are these calls for volunteers. But of course, that's not going to be ready until 1916. So the idea behind the new armies is the French and the Russians will wear down the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. And when everybody's worn down, by 1916, Britain will come in with its new armies and launch the final knockout blow and be able to be the main power at the table, reshaping Europe and the world.
You see, Britain had the opportunity to be, if you like, the same role as America. It could have prepared, trained, and harnessed its resources and come in then. Now, you don't know what's going to happen in the meantime, but my view is people were rushed into a decision. That's the problem. I think the speed of the German attack, the mobilisation that's taken place, I think the French mobilisation on the 1st of August had an effect, to tell you the truth. And I think they were rushed into it. And if they sat back and not been so eager to get engaged, and Churchill bears part of the blame here as well, then we could have said, yeah, we'll come in, but at a time and place of our choosing.
Now, that's fascinating, and I wanted to get both of your personal opinions on whether Britain was right to enter the war when it did. I mean, by the sounds of it, Chris, you would kind of take the view that we should have waited a bit longer and seen how things developed.
Absolutely, and that would have been our instinct throughout most of the 19th century. Look at what we did during the Franco-Prussian War. We weren't worried then, and yet, having said that, everybody expected France to defeat Prussia quite heavily, and it didn't happen. But I think we have to accept that it's fairly evenly balanced. And Alex's point is well made. There is a definite push for moral principles in relation to this. And when you've seen Germany resorting every time to military attack in support of its diplomacy, you're thinking, well, OK, if they're doing it on land, they're going to do it at sea as well. And I can't stress enough this idea that there's this perception, and well, not just a perception, Germany's saying it, we will put raiding groups out into the world and we will disrupt trade. Well, there's only one trade that's going to be disrupted, and that's British trade. And you've only got to look at the opening moves of the war at sea in World War I, where you have the Battle of Coronel, where a British squadron is annihilated. You have 2 battle cruisers sent down to deal with von Spey's squadron at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. That squadron, the Pacific Squadron, was specifically there to disrupt the choke points and the trade of the world that is dominated by Britain.
Alex, what about you? Was Britain right to enter the First World War in August 1914?
You see, it's a tricky one.
It's deterministic, isn't it?
Well, so the way I see it is that knowing what we know now, with all those dead and the weakening of Britain's power, and then all of the evil consequences that came out of the First World War, long attritional war, quite possibly not. Because if Britain hadn't entered the war would have been a lot shorter. It would have been a lot less traumatic. There still would have been many continental dead, but we're looking at a war, the Great War of 1914 to 15, not the Great War of 1914 to 18. The flip side of that, of course, is that in 1914, British statesmen have to ask themselves, OK, this is bigger than the Franco-Prussian War. All of continental Europe is involved. Germany is much more powerful than Prussia was in 1870. And are we willing to face a German-dominated continent with a German-dominated northern coast, with a huge German fleet, which is looking, as Chris has said, to disrupt and change the balance of power, not just in Europe, but globally, when, for what appears to be relatively limited outlay, financial and maritime support, plus a final push 2 years down the line, we can determine the fate of the world. So I think they probably were wrong, but I think it's difficult to condemn them from the stance of 1914.
I mean, it's interesting. If you look at it from a balance of power point of view, this is the argument. When you've had a century of balance of power on the continent, more than that, actually, if you go back to the Napoleonic era, you do not want a continental system that excludes Britain from it. That's the key point. It can't rely totally on its empire in that respect. Having said that, there is a military balance of power going on here because there's Russia. Russia has not been defeated at the start of the war. Tannenberg hasn't happened. And so everybody's thinking, well, we all know what happens in history. Russia rolls forward and this tidal wave actually hits Europe. So there's a confidence that Russia actually might do better than... and remember, again, retrospective wisdom isn't great here. Russia was industrialising and doing pretty well as well. And had it continued, that would have actually showed itself in the 20s and 30s. So everybody's actually relying quite a bit on Russia here.
Yeah, there's a history of overestimating the Russian military's capabilities, isn't there? I think the other thing that's important to emphasise as well when thinking about this is that the German Empire of 1914 is not Hitler's Germany of 1939. No. And that's also important to remember. I mean, Britain, France, Russia, Germany have quite a lot in common in terms of their ideologies. And the most autocratic and oppressive regime in this Europe of the pre-First World War era is in fact not Germany, it's not Austria-Hungary, it's Russia. And it's really odd that, in some ways, ideologically, that Britain and Russia are allies in this conflict.
I mean, what's interesting about this, the whole debate, is if you read all the newspapers and documentation around 1918, 1920, everybody says it was worth it to stop the Hun. It's only later, when David Lloyd George brings out his memoirs in the 1930s, that people go, crikey, all those dead people in the trenches and all the sort of retrospective thinking again goes on. But quite clearly, at the end of the war, people are saying it was worth it to stop the Hun.
Well, look at the way the Hague's reputation changed. I mean, at the end of the First World War, he was a national hero. Now it's far more nuanced.
Nuanced, I think, is a kind word.
but it's absolutely true. And also one thing that we've got to think about as well is the failure of the peace treaties that ended this. Maybe if something other than Versailles, if there had been some other more effectual post-war reconstruction, we'd be talking about, of course, going in 1914 was worth it. Britain had to go in. But that victory won at such enormous cost wasn't then backed up by the peace treaty.
Yeah,
exactly.
So when people talk about this being a catastrophic mistake, Britain's entry into the First World War, or the First World War full stop, it's not just about the casualties, it's about the geopolitical landscape that then is there afterwards and doesn't lead to lasting peace in Europe.
So let's be a bit contemporary. how you end wars, how you make peaces, how you find some sort of reconciliation, or how you stop further aggression is utterly key both to any judgment of whether a war was worthwhile and what the future will hold.
Well, the key thing is, ask yourself, what is Britain's war aim here? That's the thing. If you fulfill your war aim and their objectives, then the war is justified. Your involvement is also justified. So if you ask people in 1918, were your war aims and objectives fulfilled? I doubt if any politician can actually sort of answer that.
I suppose one thing we do have to consider, if Britain never enters the First World War, presumably the US never enters the First World War either.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, because the US entered the war in 1917 primarily as a result of Germany attacking neutral trade with submarines. Chris's disruption again, this is it. If Britain hadn't entered the war, the submarine blockade of 1917 would never have been introduced.
Well, the war would probably be over by 1917
The war would probably be over, but no reason for US to enter.
Having said that, what if Britain is supplying France and Russia through its merchant fleet? Is Germany tempted then to say, well, actually, you're helping belligerents here? And
so Germany may declare war on Britain?
No. Germany may actually say, I'm going to interfere. We're going to obviously board your vessels, inspect them for contraband goods going into belligerent countries, and if necessary, we'll take them as prizes. If you don't stop, we might sink you. So there is a scenario.
Would they do that, though? Because that would provoke Britain into entering the war.
Well, it's a balance, isn't it? I mean, they weren't worried about provoking the Americans in the end because they'd been so squeezed with the blockade that they had to do something. And after Jutland, they actually say, look, we're not going to risk that again. So let's get unrestricted U-boat warfare in. But, Britain, the temptation to do what America did to Britain, and that is exploit the vulnerability of the countries who are at war. I mean, I have to say, I think the political and economic culture at the time would have been to do that and to supply, both France and Russia with the munitions necessary and also the goods they need. So there is a scenario which says that you could have actually had that happening. That brings Britain in, as you say. America then obviously may get dragged across, but I doubt it at that point. I mean, if you bring Britain in, I think, Alex, we discussed earlier the fact that if you combine the resources of France and Russia, it gives the Central Powers a 15% economic advantage. You bring Britain in, it gives the Allied powers a 60% advantage in terms of resources. And that's quite overwhelming in terms of economic pressure. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that economic pressure wins this war as well as what happens on the ground and at sea.
Alex, what's your take on that?
So I think that even with Britain supplying France and Russia, and bear in mind that Britain didn't have a huge arms industry in the sense of supplying militaries, I think Germany would have defeated France and Russia by 1915, 1916 tops. So I don't think it would have been necessary for the Germans, and I don't think they would have risked it either. The army isn't particularly keen to fight the British. It's not particularly bothered either way. The Navy is very keen but has less say. But above all, the civilian government, the Chancellor Betterman Holweg, knows how powerful Britain is. And I think that given he was able to limit particularly attacks which might provoke the US up until 1917, he would have been able to limit them against Britain as well. It wouldn't have been necessary. The German army would have beaten France and Russia.
I tell you what, let's do now what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves, if Britain hadn't entered the First World War, what might the rest of the 20th century have looked like? This is History Undone. OK, so under this scenario, we're saying that Britain has never entered the First World War. As a result, it's almost certainly led to a German victory in 1915, maybe 1916 latest. Almost certainly the US never get involved in the First World War. Chris, do you get a kind of post-war treaty in the style of the Treaty of Versailles, nonetheless?
Well, of course, you had a Treaty of Versailles at the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. I think the German war aim now will be to neutralise France for the future. That's the key point. So you're going to take quite a lot of territory, I think, probably Belgium, and also the industrial areas of northern France. You need the coal and steel. anyway. But actually, you're going to want to build up a real barrier here to make sure the French can't actually have another go at you. And indeed, you can intervene at will. What I think is going to happen is the Germans will make the French an offer they can't refuse in terms of economic engagement. And if you look at the 19th century, the German Empire is built on a thing called the Zollverein, which is a customs union. And I think the Germans would have said, look, it's in your interests and ours to actually trade together. We can exclude this lot here offshore. You don't like them very much anyway. And we'll bring Austria-Hungary into it. We'll settle the Balkans. We're friendly with the Turks at the moment, so we can probably have a real entente with them as well. And we've got this opportunity really to keep the Russians out.
Well, let's touch on Russia briefly. I mean, we've spoken about this in previous episodes of History Undone with you, Alex. Obviously, in 1917, what happens? We have the Russian Revolution. Does that still happen in a scenario in which World War I ends in 1915 or 1916?
I think it does, given the first Russian Revolution was just 10 years previous. And if the war ends in another defeat for Russia, yeah, I think we're looking at another Russian Revolution. I don't think we're looking at the Bolsheviks and the creation of a Soviet Union. I think it's a very different revolution. It might even be a more democratic revolution, though...
Hard to know.
Hard to know.
Yeah.
I think we've got to look at it from the Russian point of view. Let's say that its major ally, France, has been defeated. Britain's standing clear of it. The Russians are thinking, OK, what are we going to do here? And we know what happened. The Battle of Tannenberg effectively stalled the Russian advances, but they've mobilised. So their temptation will be to go down here and actually sort out the Balkans, because that's why they entered the war. In relation to Turkey, but also Serbia here. I mean, what's bearing in mind is British opinion right at the start of the war was very anti-Serb. I mean, they saw the Serbs as terrorists, fanatics, and they thought it was totally unnecessary. It's only the entry of Germany on Austro-Hungary's side that actually turns British opinion. And then, of course, all the other factors that we have discussed. My sense is that the Russians might have come to terms and said, OK, our major allies are no longer taking part. We'd like this issue sorted out in Serbia between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. On the other hand, the Austro-Hungarians might have thought, well, OK, let's go for it.
Yeah.
And we'll take on Russia, and Germany's still on side. We'll continue the war. There's a lot, as Alex knows better than I do, there's a lot going on in this part of the world, and that needs settling.
So we've got some idea of what Germany and Austria-Hungary would have wanted in the case of a victory. But as Chris says, it depends on whether it's a quick victory or whether it's one which takes longer and is more gruelling. I mean, the September programme, which was Germany's first war aims programme, as Chris says, imagines taking Belfort, which is a major French fort, so that the Germans have invasion routes into France whenever they want. It imagines making Belgium subject to Germany, not part of Germany, but subject to it, with annexations of Antwerp and Liège, and taking over the coastal ports. In the east, it's vaguer. In the east, it says we simply want to push the Russians back as far as possible. But the Austro-Hungarians have a much, much better idea of what they want here in 1914. At this time, there isn't a state of Poland. That only comes after 1918. There was a state of Poland 120 years before the First World War, and it's resurrected in 1918. But one of the things that a lot of statesmen in Austria-Hungary would like would be to join the Russian-held bits of Poland onto Austria-Hungary to make it much bigger. And initially, the Germans are quite keen on that idea because it creates a very useful barrier with a friendly ally against a much more hostile Russia.
And it removes that salient there.
Yeah.
And it removes that salient there. And given that the Austro-Hungarians went in to protect their Balkan interests, I think that they would have had, the Austro-Hungarians may well have had demands on Serbia as well. The only problem with the Austro-Hungarians is this is a multi-ethnic empire. It's got 11 different languages in it. And if you take more Serbs in the empire, or you take more Poles into the empire, that disturbs this very delicate political balance. And that's one question. That's one reason why this is such an interesting issue. We can't be absolutely certain because there's a lot of horse trading going on in the Austro-Hungarian halls of power at this time.
I think the key issue here is what happens with Turkey.
Yeah, the Ottoman Empire, does it survive?
Well, the Ottoman Empire does survive because the Germans are obviously the victors here. They're allies, they're on the right side. And remember the old Baghdad Railway that the Germans were actually building. The Germans have helped, may have actually helped more than we think, both in military terms, but also in terms of trade and communications. So let's just build on that. If the Germans continue to invest in Turkey to shore them up militarily and politically, they do build the communications down to Baghdad. They're in a position to threaten Iraq and also what is now Iraq and also Iran. And so you've then got the ability of the Germans to say, well, actually, we can move down this way with the Turks, our allies. That actually outflanks the Russians as well. And so quite an interesting development.
It sounds almost like, under this scenario, it's good for many of Europe's big empires. It's good for the German Empire, it's good for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. What about the long-term consequences on the British Empire?
If Britain hadn't entered the war, well, Britain remains much stronger in financial terms. It maintains some of its prestige, but it's going to find difficulty in getting allies among France in particular. Russia is probably in revolutionary chaos, which is good news for the British generally.
So, certainly in relation to India and the
certainly
Great
in relation,
Game.
exactly, yeah, and to India, Persia. I think we are also looking at an ideological switch, which in some ways is much more important than the military one.
Yeah.
Because the First World War, although the British Empire actually ends up larger by the war, does a huge amount to discredit the idea of imperialism. It supercharges nationalist movements right across the British Empire. Of course, we have Irish independence in the immediate aftermath of the war. There's a huge surge as well in Indian nationalist feeling, in Chinese nationalist feeling. And without Britain's involvement in the First World War, that may still take place, but it's a lot slower.
Chris, do you agree with that? Do you think maybe the British Empire emerges in the long term stronger from not having entered the First World War?
Well, I think the key point is it doesn't weaken so quickly. That's the key point. And it may well be that actually a new imperial structure comes out of it in relation to what Alex says of what's going on the continent here. We've got to go back to the Napoleonic period to see the last time a major power dominated the continent of Europe and what the implications of that were. I mean, the key point for me is this issue about the way Germany wants to challenge at sea. And it's not just related to sea power, it's related to colonies. There is a huge hunger in Germany for this place in the sun, for the colonies. They've got a few scattered ones, Qingdao in China. They've got a few other paltry sort of returns from the scramble around the world, but they want colonies. And so that implies they have to build up their navy, they have to push their financial and other systems. And that inevitably is going to be a clash of empires, I think. So we could have actually seen a British Empire against the German Empire with all the resources that they've been able to actually harness here in Central Europe. So we're into a Napoleonic struggle again.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the key questions, isn't it, under this scenario? I suppose what we're leading towards is, do you end up with a Second World War in the 20th century? You've got a different balance of power at the end of the First World War, if it's been won by Germany because Britain never entered and the US never entered. But is it inevitable that at some point, later on in the 20th century, they're going to have to lock horns again?
So nothing is inevitable, James. That's important. I think that it's possible. I think that what we end up with is zones of interest, and we end up with a 19th century, the continuation of a 19th century style of imperialism where might is right. None of the big international organisations which are meant to mediate between powers, the League of Nations after 1918 or the United Nations in the second half of the 20th century, none of that international cooperation, organisation, fora, they never come about. Instead, we end up actually something like a world perhaps that we're entering into today, where international organisations aren't present or are less important. And it's the big powers that determine their interests by hard power, by militaries. So we're certainly looking at a much more militaristic, imperialistic, and I think tense world, yeah, for sure.
There's so much we could talk about. I've got a few final sort of quick-fire questions for each of you. Chris, first of all, Ireland, of course, you have the Easter Rising in 1916. They gain their independence in 1921. Does that still happen on that timeline?
Yes, because I think the Government of Ireland Act that was passed in 1914 actually puts you on the road to that. What I think may have happened is you may have actually had a much more settled relationship between the North and the South. You may even have actually had a united Ireland at that point if Home Rule had been given.
Okay.
And in fact, the Ulster Protestants hadn't actually cut up really badly about it, and you needed to separate the 6 provinces. So you might have actually had Ireland not independent, but actually Home Rule, and actually part of the United Kingdom, or indeed part of the Empire at that point. So it might have actually worked out in a different way. But there's this huge tussle between the Ulster Protestants and the rest of Ireland, which results in the separation. So, that's a result of that. And of course, there's this sense of betrayal in Britain that, there was the Easter Rising in 1916. So there's a lot of animus against the Irish at the end of the war for actually betraying the mother country. And
then the US, Alex. Does American isolationism continue much deeper into the 20th century? It's a kind of psychology if they've never had to get involved in the First World War.
So I think in relation to Europe it does. The US already has big interests in the Pacific before the First World War, and I think it would have wanted to maintain and expand them against a rising Japan, potentially. I think the other big impact, though, thinking about the US, is the idea of the spread of democracy, which is very important for the US at the end of the war. Key part of Versailles is meant to be that democracy is going to spread, the rights of small nations, national self-determination. And none of that comes about if the US doesn't enter the war. Instead, what we end up with is a much more conservative world. We end up with a world where class assumptions, I think, haven't been tested by the Soviets. We end up with a world in which the racist assumptions of this world order aren't tested in the way that they were, as well. And all of that comes in part as a result of the US staying out of this war, staying isolationist, or even making its main focus eastward toward the Pacific.
Chris, briefly?
Yeah, I mean, Alex makes a good point. I mean, do you get fascism and communism in the forms that they are? Without Hitler, you're not going to have the Second World War in the same way that we think about it. As far as the Far East is concerned, the Asia-Pacific region, Japan's going to say, well, actually, Russia's shown itself to be quite weak here, so we might just renew our hostility to actually gain territory there. But I think the key point is that Japan, who, of course, at the end of the First World War got treaty territories in the Pacific, won't have those, and I am sure it would have turned its attention fully on China, because China is disintegrating at this point. It's the plaything of most of the major powers. The major powers will be in there. Japan almost certainly will look to get into Manchuria at an early stage, probably by the end of the 1920s. And at that point, do these empires say, look, we have interests in the Asia-Pacific, do we need to take on Japan?
Gentlemen, as ever, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much. I think we can say, first of all, that Britain's entry into the First World War was a pivotal turning point in that war. And had Britain not entered, it's very possible, maybe even very likely, that Germany would have won. The First World War would have been far shorter, over by 1915, maybe 1916, and certainly the US would never have needed to enter. Under that scenario, the rest of the 20th century looks very, very different. Not only is the German Empire far bigger, potentially pushing into France and certainly Belgium, but also the Austro-Hungarian Empire survives. The Ottoman Empire almost certainly survives. What happens in Russia? Do you still get the Russian Revolution of 1917? As discussed, probably yes, but it may not be the Bolshevik Revolution that we ended up seeing. As a result, do you get the rise of the Soviet Union? Do you get the rise of communism? Crucially, does the 20th century have another Great War down the line? Is this inevitably heading towards a future conflict, potentially between a still stronger British Empire and a German Empire? Do the US get involved in that? What happens with the Russians? That is a question that is almost unknowable, but certainly the latter part of the 20th century would almost certainly look very, very different. And not least, you would not get the rise of the ideologies of fascism and communism in the way that we did. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Professor Alexander Watson and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me, and we will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. Don't forget you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.